everyone, and thanks for tuning in to the White Goods Revolution, How Machines Found a Place in Our Homes, presented as part of our Belongings, Objects and Family Life public program, and also presented for Women's History Month. My name is Katie, and I'm the Public Programs Coordinator here at the Old Treasury Building. Now, before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands we are presenting from today. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded. Our speaker today is a feminist historian with research interests in women's history, the history of family, and material history. And she is, of course, the director of the Old Treasury Building, Margaret Anderson. Thank you, Margaret.
Thanks, Katie, very much. And can I repeat Katie's acknowledgement of the Wurundjeri Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation? I'm also speaking from their unceded land. Now, would I be right in guessing that few of us actually enjoy housework? We may vary in how fussy we are around the house, and I doubt that any of us are actually afraid of it, as this fun cartoon from Judy Horacek implies. But I suspect that most of us try to achieve whatever tasks we set ourselves in the minimum of time and with the minimum of effort. Now, luckily, we can now call on a huge range of handy appliances to help us out. From the kitchen to the laundry and most rooms in between, there are machines to help us with the work. Who amongst us hasn't fantasized about their dream kitchen, packed with gleaming white goods or sparkling stainless steel? Here is one just to set the mood. A modern kitchen will now contain many appliances, both large and small. There will be an oven or two, a cooktop, either standalone or with the oven, probably a microwave, certainly a fridge and a freezer, either built-in or standalone, and almost certainly a dishwasher. On the bench tops or in the cupboards will be smaller appliances, a kettle, a toaster, perhaps a coffee machine, a sandwich maker, an electric mixer, a blender, or a food processor. I could go on. Elsewhere, we will store a vacuum cleaner, perhaps a mini vac, certainly a washing machine, probably a clothes dryer, perhaps a sewing machine. Many homes will have heating of some sort and probably cooling as well. And that is in an ordinary home. Now travel back in time to 1840, to the earliest homes of Melbourne. And the only thing that might be called an appliance we can find will be a fireplace with hooks for hanging cooking pots, perhaps with an oven at the side. In fact, for almost all of human history, work about the home was powered by a combination of muscle power and elbow grease, and it was hard work. So banish any romantic notion you may have of women in beautiful dresses languishing on sofas or reading by the fireside. If they had time to do that, it was only because they were wealthy enough to employ other women to do their housework for them. And very few women in colonial Victoria were actually rich enough to do that. So let's look at some of the everyday tasks about the home in the past and think about how and when appliances were invented to help out. I should also say that for almost all of the time we'll talk about today, this was work that was done by women. Until the 1970s, and arguably longer than that, it was assumed that woman's primary role was to be a wife and mother. Care of the home was her job. In fact, from as early as the 1860s, there was a specific word for this, housewife. This summed it up nicely. It was the housewife's job to cook for her family, to clean the house, to launder the clothes, and often to make them too. A popular saying made it clear that this was an endless round of work with next to no downtime. Now, there are various versions of this saying, but a common one goes like this. Man works to a set of sun, but woman's work is never done. And even now we might feel that housework is never truly done, as anyone with children knows only too well. But in the past, it involved hours and hours of hard labour, with little rest at the end of the day, only to start all over again on the next. And at first, the only tools available to help were very simple ones. So let's start in the kitchen. By comparison with our modern light gleaming kitchens, kitchens in the 1840s were often small, cramped, and dark, and were frequently housed in a lean-to structure at the rear of a house or separated from it. This was from fear of fire. Until the mid-century, many homes in Melbourne were built of wood, with either wooden shingled roofs or even thatch. Brick and stone houses and slate roofs gradually superseded these early dwellings, but the fear of fire kept kitchens in the rear of houses for many years. The equipment in those houses gradually improved over time. Obviously, the very first huts had very rudimentary arrangements, often only a cookpot, either placed on a trivet or suspended from a tripod over an open fire outside the house. Damper, a kind of unleavened bread, could be cooked in a pot buried in the ashes. Such arrangements were common again on the goldfields in the 1850s, as you can see in this S.T. Gill painting here. In the towns, cooking on wood or coal-fired stoves was common until the late 19th century, and well after that in poorer districts. The first stoves were open ranges, seen at the top of this slide, with pots suspended over open fires, sometimes with small closed ovens on the side. These stoves made kitchens hot and smoky, and fire, as we've seen, was an ever-present danger. The closed range was a great improvement, and you can see one in the slide at the bottom here. And it gradually replaced the open range from the mid-19th century. A far greater variety of cooking was possible on the closed range, but still, many households couldn't bake their own bread or manage the weekly roast. This was commonly taken to a nearby baker to cook for a small fee. Those, like my great-grandfather, who could bake their roast at home, saw this as something to celebrate. My great-grandfather, Joseph Elliott, came to Adelaide from England in 1850 at the tender age of 16. Within a year, he married a young woman he met on the boat, giving his age as 20, and another year after that became a father. Now, tragically, his first wife died of puerperal fever, leaving him with an infant son to rear. And as often happened in such cases, baby Joseph also died some 9 months later. A little over a year after the death of his first wife, Joseph married again to Rebecca, his first wife's friend. And this time he claimed to be 22. And they went on to have a large family. In 1860, Joseph sat down to write a long and detailed letter to his mother. He called the letter Our Home in Australia, and in it he described in minute detail their house, which was a rented cottage in North Adelaide, and all their possessions. Now, Joseph was a highly literate man who'd found work at the Register newspaper. He also taught evening classes to adults, and his letter shows a wry sense of humour. He illustrated it with little sketches. This is his sketched plan of their kitchen, which he says was the largest room in the house. And he followed this up with a close-up sketch of the fireplace and oven, with this detailed explanation. The fireplace has a very nice cedar front and mantelpiece, and Rebecca keeps the bricks always brilliantly black-leaded. The kettle, a large iron one, stands on the hob on the left, and on the right is the fireplace belonging, or rather going under and around the oven, which is one of those large iron kegs, bricked in and a shelf put inside. It bakes first rate. We send no meat, etc., to the bakers to bake, and sometimes we have some nice homemade bread. Now, cooking on a wood-fired stove required skill and planning. The first job of the day was inevitably rekindling the kitchen fire, which was commonly banked up overnight. Nothing could then be done until the fire heated either the stove tops or the contents of the cauldrons, which took some time. A large kettle of water was usually then left simmering on the stove, ready for tea, cooking water, and washing water throughout the day. Even making a cup of tea required time and forethought. If you've ever tried to heat a kettle of cold water on a wood-fired stove top, you will know that it takes an incredibly long time to come to the boil. So the electric jug or kettle when they arrived must have seemed miraculous. The temperature of early ovens was not regulated except by adding fuel or allowing the oven to cool. Nor was there a temperature gauge, which meant that early cooks had to learn to judge the heat of the oven by feel, that is, by putting their hand inside the oven. Dishes requiring the hottest oven, like bread or scones, were then cooked first, with other dishes replacing them as the oven cooled. Slow-cooked dishes like milk puddings were generally cooked last. Skill and judgment were acquired over time, and girls often learned to cook from their mothers, beginning with simple dishes while they were quite young. Later, they were also taught cookery at school, on the assumption that even educated girls who went to high school would still need to know how to manage a household. And cleaning these fireplaces and ovens was a daily task. The rashers were raked out daily and the fire reset, while all the surfaces were cleaned and polished with graphite to remove ash and smoke debris. It was especially important to keep fire surrounds spotlessly clean, because these were also used to heat the flat irons, which were used to iron clothes. Not surprisingly then, the advent of gas stoves was welcomed. Cooking with gas was far cleaner, and the heat was instant. So not surprisingly, gas stoves spread quickly into middle-class households during the 1870s and 80s, once the gas supplies were readily available. By 1874, the market in wood and coal was reporting a downturn, which observers attributed to the increased number of gas stoves in use. Many were manufactured locally. Here's a photograph of the Wallace Brothers factory, probably taken between about 1882 and 1886. Danks & Co. was another manufacturer who sold local and imported goods from their various premises. Both companies exhibited their stoves at the Melbourne International Exhibition, held in the exhibition building in 1880. But the transition to cooking with gas was not always a smooth one. At first, gas was supplied by private gas companies who served different localities. In the 1870s and into the 1880s, there were repeated complaints about the inadequate supply of gas, which could result in low pressure and interrupted cooking at times of greatest demand, to the great irritation of customers. There were many letters of complaint to the local newspapers in these years. And it all sounds a little bit like contemporary problems with the electricity grid, doesn't it? Many of these early gas cookers were relatively small by comparison with modern stoves, but larger ranges were also made to serve large kitchens and things like restaurants, and we can see a variety of sizes and styles in the exhibition hall. At first, they were all black, and like earlier stoves, had to be blacked and polished. But from about 1910, manufacturers began to make stoves with enamel finishes to make them easier to clean. The Meta's early cooker state model is in the collection of Museums Victoria. It dates from about 1926 and was made in the Meta's factory in Footscray. This particular one was used in a kitchen in North Caulfield until, would you believe, 2001. When the then owner moved into a nursing home. And that's pretty amazing longevity. Like many wood-fired ovens of the period, this stove had no thermostat, and users had to estimate the temperature of the oven by hand and experience. A small thermometer was used in this oven to check the temperature from the 1950s. Now, gas was promoted initially because it produced instant heat and because it was economical. The gas could be turned off when not in use. A wood-fired stove, by comparison, had to be kept burning all day. By the 1920s, there were also electric stoves on the market, but they took much longer to catch on. Initially, electric stoves were imported and were very expensive. But from the early 1920s, they were also manufactured locally. For example, at the Heckler factory in Little Bourke Street, as shown here. These early electric stoves look very similar to the gas stoves of the period. But far fewer houses used electricity for anything other than lighting at this time, and electricity was also a more expensive fuel than gas. As late as 1955, only about 24% of homes in Melbourne had an electric stove installed. Now, often working-class households could afford neither gas nor electricity, and many were still cooking on wood stoves during the Second World War. Fuel rationing hit these households especially hard, since they needed wood both for cooking and for heating. It was not until the 1950s that electric stoves really began to rival gas. Now here is Hotpoint's advertisement for its range of so-called electric servants, published in the Australian Women's Weekly in 1950. This showed the new electric oven alongside that other new essential, the refrigerator, with a host of smaller appliances illustrated below. By this time, both the oven and the fridge were made in gleaming white enamelled steel. Which brings us to the other major appliance now found in almost all, if not all, kitchens in Australia, the refrigerator. We now consider a fridge essential to food safety in our warm climate. But in historical terms, it's a relative newcomer to the kitchens of the nation. Keeping food fresh and safe was a constant challenge in colonial kitchens. In the summer months, butter quickly melted and became rancid, while milk and meat spoiled. Most women shopped daily in small quantities to feed their families safely. On farms, women could keep some perishable goods in dams or creeks, but this was not an option in the city. Rebecca and Joseph Elliott used what he called a large safe, which he described in these terms. This is a very strong article of my own making and is very safe. Not a fly or anything whatever can get to the inside unless through the perforated zinc or when the door is open. It has a zinc front and two sides, and all the corners of the wood are closely joined and covered with tin. It has 3 shelves inside and is used for edibles requiring air, but not too much of it. I'm not aware that we have ever had any meat spoilt whilst it has been in the safe. Now, given Adelaide's ferocious summers, that seems a bit hard to believe, especially as Joseph describes elsewhere that they roasted a leg of mutton without fail every Sunday and then ate slices progressively throughout the week. However, this was not a device for cooling food, merely preserving it from the air and obvious pests. Some large establishments and hotels had ice boxes from the mid-19th century, but at first the ice for these chests had to be imported from America and Canada. The ice was cut from lakes and ponds in the winter, packed in straw, and shipped to hopper climates. Hundreds of shiploads arrived in Melbourne during the gold rush years, with arrivals of ice reported in the local newspapers. Of course, a good deal of the ice melted en route, and the remaining ice was extremely expensive. Both ice and ice boxes themselves were beyond the means of most ordinary people. But from the 1850s, a local inventor perfected a process for making artificial ice as it was first known. In 1851, James Harrison designed and built the world's first refrigeration plant in Geelong. In November 1858, he founded the Victoria Ice Works in Melbourne and began to produce ice in commercial quantities. At first, there was some resistance to this so-called artificial ice. Consumers complained that it was not as cold as imported ice. But refrigeration plants were soon established throughout Australia and the world, making it possible for households to count on regular deliveries of ice. Although weekly deliveries might suffice in winter, several deliveries were often required in the summer, which meant a regular outlay for the housewife. Ice carts were soon a common sight in the city, and the ice man was as recognisable as the milkman in suburban streets. During the Second World War, there were also ice women, as this photograph from 1844 makes clear. An ice chest, also known as an ice box, comprised a freestanding cabinet made of wood and lined with galvanised iron or the more expensive porcelain enamel. The cabinets were commonly insulated with charcoal or cork, but a range of materials was used for insulation: fur pelt, hair, wool, felt, ash, even asbestos. A large block of ice was placed in a tray at the top of the cabinet, and the melted water piped from the ice tray to a drip tray underneath the chest. Several shelves inside the ice chest stored the food. Ice boxes were made from the late 19th century until about the 1950s, but not all households could afford to buy either a chest or the ice. During the 1920s, prices ranged from £2 to £5, and it was estimated that only about 20% of urban households owned one. During the 1930s, the icebox shown here on the left, made by Tianco in South Melbourne, retailed for £2, 12 and 6. Handy householders could also make their own ice chests, as this set of instructions published in 1935 suggests. They could also refashion butter boxes or kerosene tins to serve this purpose. But ice boxes were only an option for urban dwellers, since ice deliveries were never a practical proposition outside large towns. The other option for keeping food cool was the much cheaper storage container known as the Coolgardie safe. An invention of the hot and dusty Western Australian goldfields in 1895, the safe consisted of a timber or metal frame cabinet with open sides covered in hessian fabric. A tank on top of the cabinet was filled with water, and strips of flannel or felt hung from the tank to the hessian. Through a process of capillary siphoning or wicking, water seeped through the hessian, keeping it damp. The safe was usually kept on a veranda or covered way, usually in a direct breeze. As the breeze passed through the wet hessian, the fabric absorbed the heat from the surrounding air and kept the safe cool. It was ingenious and also simple. The safe also protected food from flies and scavengers, with the feet placed in a tray of water to deter ants, much as Joseph Elliott described for his own safe. Now, the Coolgardie safe could not keep food as cool as an ice chest, but it was much cheaper to buy and to maintain. In 1913, you can see here, they could be bought for as little as 10 and 6pence. Many such safes were also homemade, with plans often published in newspapers and weekly magazines. The cost of a homemade safe might be as little as 4 shillings in the 1930s, when it was estimated that 4 out of every 5 households had one. The safes did require a regular supply of water, though, and they could use up to 8 gallons or 30 litres every day in the hot weather. Now, while commercial refrigeration plants existed in most countries by the late 19th century, creating a scaled-down version for domestic use was much more difficult. It was not really until the 1920s that various designs were created and produced, at first in America. Some were imported into Australia, but they were extremely expensive. These early refrigerators were powered by electricity, and at first they also used a great deal of power. The refrigerants used were quite toxic at first. It was not until inventors discovered Freon, a chlorofluorocarbon, or CFC, if we remember those, in the late 1920s, that the domestic market really began to expand. General Electric's monitor top was one of the most popular brands to be imported. The monitor top was made of steel, lined with white porcelain. It was much smaller than modern fridges, with only 3 shelves and a tiny freezing compartment. The exterior compressor was the first domestic compressor to be so-called hermetically sealed or airtight. Advertising claimed the entire mechanism is fortified against air, dirt, and moisture with impregnable walls of steel. The monitor top was a bestseller in America. In Australia, it retailed for £69 in 1935, which was a huge sum when the average weekly wage for adult men was then just over £5. The first Australian-made domestic refrigerator was the Icy Ball, built by Sir Edward Holstrom in 1928. The Icy Ball was a chest model that ran on kerosene and sold mostly to country properties which had no electricity or nearby iceworks. Holstrom's next refrigerator, the Silent Night, was introduced in 1935 and ran on gas or electricity. The Silent Night was quieter than other models on the market, hence the name. It was efficient and reasonably priced. Operating costs were its major downside. They were so expensive that Sir Edward was said to have made an arrangement with the electricity suppliers to subsidise the electricity bills of purchasers of his refrigerator. Hailed as an all-Australian triumph, the Silent Night was sold as the people's refrigerator at the people's price. But nevertheless, the delivery of a new fridge was apparently a newsworthy event in some regional areas. In January 1941, the Mudgee Guardian announced the new refrigeration owners in the district, all proud owners of the Holstrom Silent Night. In the middle of the war, managing to remain in business and even obtain the steel was probably an achievement in itself. After the war, business began to take off. By the mid-1940s, Holstrom's Proprietary Limited was selling 1,200 refrigerators per week and employed over 700 people in their factory. In 1949, the Gilgandra Weekly informed their readers that demand was so high there would be a delay of 7 months for new stock. In the late 1930s, other Australian manufacturers entered the market. Charles Hope, Calder, and Kirby, and American manufacturers General Motors, Kelvinator, and Westinghouse also established manufacturing plants in Australia. These fridges begin to look more recognisable. Mass production and increased competition after the Second World War reduced costs, but refrigerators still were not common in Australia until the 1950s. What we might call the white goods revolution really began in earnest in the 1950s. As the war ended and domestic manufacturing returned to normal, the production of white goods expanded into a sizable segment of the industrial economy. Now, this advertisement was published by Hotpoint in 1943 and looked forward to a bright new future defined by labour-saving electric servants who would give Susan, shown here in the advertisement, everything she needed for a happy life. When I'm a grown-up lady, I'll have a beautiful house, this advertisement begins. Indeed you will, Susan. A wonderful home, and all the work will be done by electricity. I won't have to wash clothes, says Susan. Of course not. And neither will you have to sweep, dust and clean, or wash dishes. You won't have to iron by hand or cook in the old-fashioned way. You'll have electric servants to do all this. And we can see all of these electric servants illustrated just down below in the margins. Now, in 1943, this was a pretty large claim. It would be decades before most households aspired to a dishwasher, and I'm not aware that anyone has ever really invented an ironing machine that can do everything. But in 1943, perhaps it was okay to dream that everything was possible after the war was over. And once the war ended, electric servants did indeed start rolling off the assembly line. Fueled by almost full employment and rising wages, households increasingly looked to equip their homes with the new appliances. Once the building material shortage induced by wartime production also lessened, homes increased in size, allowing more space for bulky machines like refrigerators, gas and electric cookers, and washing machines. Refrigerators were often at the top of the household wish list. By 1955, when this display of home appliances took place in the exhibition building, it was estimated that 67% of Melbourne homes had a refrigerator. By 1964, this figure had increased to 94%, and that's an astonishing expansion in a short space of time. Now, it's interesting that this was not necessarily replicated elsewhere. By contrast, only 5.3% of households in the United Kingdom had a refrigerator in 1953, for example. In the 1930s, refrigerators were often promoted to housewives in terms of their health benefits. Advertisements worked on fear of food contamination and disease resulting from spoiled food. But by the 1950s, the emphasis changed to the convenience offered by the refrigerator. The housewife was reminded that she need no longer shop daily for foodstuffs, that she could shop in larger quantities and still have fresh food, allowing her more time with her children, or, more daringly, time to herself. There was never any doubt about the target of these advertisements. They were aimed almost exclusively at the housewife or at the husband for his wife. This Christmas, give mother the one refrigerator she's always wanted, ran this Kelvinator advertisement, printed in the Australian Women's Weekly in December 1956. Other advertisements emphasised the labour-saving advantages of appliances like refrigerators. Happy the husband who enjoys the restful atmosphere of an easily run home, ran this advertisement by the English Electric Company. Happy is the wife who can run such a home, whose day is not a weary round of chores, who can find time to relax, see her friends, and think of herself. This was also published in the Australian Women's Weekly in November 1951, and it would be a common theme in appliance advertising throughout this period. And later in the 1950s, refrigerators moved from being purely functional objects to being designer statements, at least for the lucky few. I don't remember there ever being much prospect of our fridge being adapted to suit regular kitchen makeovers. But manufacturers did begin to offer fridges in designer colours to match the household's style and taste. The Sheer Look by Frigidaire in 1957, for example, offered customers 13 rather charming sounding colours to choose from, amongst them Fiesta Pink and Moonglow Cream. The New Season Pope, released in the next year, came in a wide range of interior and exterior colour schemes, just waiting to tone in with your kitchen colours. Crossley refrigerators promised beauty on the inside too, with new colour glow interiors. Lovely artistic fashion shades that will complement your good taste and bring exclamations of delight from all your friends, who presumably were brought in to admire the inside of your refrigerator. Now, I'm afraid this designer trend must have missed my family. Our fridge remained the standard cream throughout the 1950s. By the late 1950s, fridges began to increase in size, as this advertisement from 1957 implies. But the most important innovation was the introduction of the separate freezing compartment, which for the first time allowed goods to remain frozen for lengthy periods. I can still remember the great excitement when our family finally got the new gleaming white Frigidaire with its proper freezer compartment. Our dog was probably the only one who missed the old fridge, Once we had the new fridge, we could buy ice cream in large plastic punnets rather than the little cardboard cartons that were designed to be consumed at one sitting. Our dog used to get to lick the cardboard cartons afterwards, in what seems, I gather, to have been quite a common treat for doggies. The new fridge, with its separate freezer at the top rather than the bottom, as shown in this model, was a huge advance in our home. Quite apart from ice cream, which became almost an everyday dessert in the 1960s, my mother could buy sliced bread and keep it fresh. No more stale bread on Mondays. But no pressing excuse for a school lunch order either. There are disadvantages to everything. Household cooking changed in response to the more efficient refrigerators and the freezers. Cold cookery became a new trend, with all kinds of mousses and ice confections replacing the tired old junkets and blancmanges. And we should not forget the frozen vegetables. I suspect that frozen peas were ubiquitous in many households from the 1960s. Preserving the produce of backyard gardens also became much easier. As freezers became larger and blossomed into separate appliances, thrifty housewives had less need of Fowler's preserving jars to keep the year's fruit and vegetable crop. They could simply stew the fruit and freeze it in containers. My own mother persevered with the preserving jars for quite a few years, but eventually gave up and bought a chest freezer. The long-cherished art form of preserving fruit in jars is now a rarity. It was always a hot and tiring job, of course, and there was always one jar that didn't seal properly. Now, contemporary fridges now come in all sorts of combinations: half and half fridge freezers, paired fridge freezers, and smart fridges that can do all sorts of clever things. It goes without saying that most now defrost themselves, though not always entirely reliably, I have to say, with some feeling. There is one other area of household work which we have yet to visit, and that was the most hated job of all in the 19th and early 20th century, the laundry. Laundry was the worst job because it was hot, heavy work that often took all day. Housewives and all their servants often rose at 5 in the morning on wash days because, of course, they had to heat all the water before they could even begin. Then the heavy linens and other colour-fast items were boiled, usually in a copper, before being wrung out and put through several changes of rinsing water. The final rinse often contained a bluing agent to make the whites look whiter. Articles that couldn't be boiled were usually washed in a wash tub using a washboard. The clothes were first soaked in soapy water, then rubbed against the ridges on the washboard to dislodge dirt, before being rinsed and dried. The first washboards were made of wood, but later they could be made with ridges made of zinc or glass. They were first used in the early 19th century, but continued in use well into the 20th century. Their advantage was that they were easily portable, and they soon became essential equipment in many households. Hand-wringing of hot, wet clothing was punishing work, and professional laundresses often suffered from what doctors called washerwomen's hands. From the description, a modern diagnosis would probably be something like carpal tunnel syndrome. This was a very serious complaint, and the only real remedy was rest, so any washerwoman who developed this complaint may well have been unable to work. Wringing machines, often called mangles, were available. They could be heavy objects mounted in a frame like this one for large objects like sheets and towels, or smaller models designed to sit on the side of a wash tub. A professional washerwoman would often own a mangle, but it was not a machine that was easily transported. Such women usually worked from their own homes. The washing was brought to them and was often delivered back again by the washerwomen's children. This was a very common task for children in poor families. taking in washing was one task that women could perform while at home with small children. And we know from a letter written by one woman called Lucy Hart to her mother in 1852 that it was a common strategy in uncertain times, when a woman was widowed or deserted, or when her husband's earnings were interrupted or insufficient. At the time of writing to her mother, Lucy's husband had finally managed to establish himself as a carter after being lucky enough to find some gold on the diggings, meaning that Lucy no longer needed to take in washing. As she wrote triumphantly to her mother, "So I do nothing but my own work now." Older women with no small children at home might also hire themselves out as laundresses for the day, doing the washing for a household in their homes. This might be a solution in a household where there was only one servant, for example, a very common arrangement in the 19th century. Such home laundries were often set up with a copper and either 2 or 3 rinsing troughs side by side. At first, the coppers were wood-fired, but later they were often connected to either gas or electricity. The clothes were cleaned by the boiling action with the addition of soap or washing soda. My mother was still using this arrangement in the early 1950s. She didn't have her first washing machine until the mid-50s, and even then still put the clothes manually through the rinsing troughs using the wringer on top of the washing machine. She always maintained that cottons and linens washed whiter in the copper, and that it was the very best way to get nappies clean. This was a time, incidentally, when wet nappies were usually simply rinsed and dried before reuse. Dirty nappies were put to soak, and then everything was boiled up weekly. Now, hard as wash day could be in comfortable households, it was an even greater struggle for the poor. In many inner Melbourne suburbs, laundries were often makeshift, lean-to structures tacked onto the backs of houses, if they existed at all. This continued to be the case into the 1930s and 40s, despite attempts to improve so-called slum housing. One poor mother was photographed by F. Oswald Barnett, washing in what he described as her open-air washhouse in Collingwood in 1935. Her galvanised iron tub was propped on a plank in an arrangement that Oswald described as typical of thousands, and she was scrubbing clothes by hand. There is no sign in the photograph of either copper or wringer, and the clothesline is an improvised wire attached to a veranda post. Her 2 children stand nearby, dressed in clothing that looks as if it might have been made from Hessian bags, and the older child was probably charged with keeping the toddler out of the way. It's a pretty wretched scene. Now, the use of starch for some linens and parts of clothing was common practice well into the 1950s. Starching produced a glossy, smooth finish to things like tablecloths or men's shirt collars. It also made them easier to launder because the stains and dirt generally washed off with the starch. But starching was an added process with its own pitfalls. Learning to mix and apply starch to create an even finish with no sticky lumps was part of a girl's training as a housewife or a general servant. Many early cookbooks contained recipes for starching, although in truth most involved using what was called starch powder. Starching was done as a separate process after the final rinse. It involved dipping items in a prepared starch mix before further wringing out and drying. Starched items were then damped down again before they were ironed. There were grades of starching from heavy to light, depending on the degree of stiffness that was required. This was achieved partly by the amount of starch in the mix and partly by the number of times an item was passed through the starch. Tablecloths, for example, were often given a stiff layer of starch, as were men's collars and cuffs, while ladies' frilled collars or children's pinafores might be more lightly starched. At different times, ladies' petticoats were starched to help support a desired shape in dress fashion. It meant that they sometimes rustled or swished as they walked. Starched articles had to be ironed when damp to get rid of wrinkles. So after drying, such items then had to be sprinkled with water and rolled up to await the iron. It was yet another step in a laborious process. Advertisements like this one shown here tried to make starching appear easy, but like much housework, it required knowledge, skill, and elbow grease. Machines that could wash clothes were available in the 19th century, but very few people had them. Some had to be rocked by hand to agitate the clothes in the tub, a heavy, time-consuming task that probably required much more effort than a copper. And apparently they didn't achieve a very good result. Electric washing machines were first marketed in the United States in the early 20th century, but very few households were able to afford to either buy or run them until after the Second World War. Many of these early post-war models were designed to work alongside existing laundry troughs and were generally used only for washing. And you can see the lady looking at one in this advertisement here. The clothes were then passed through the attached wringer into successive troughs of cold water for rinsing. Positioning the machine alongside each trough allowed the clothes to be passed through the wringer after each rinse. This arrangement also assured that wash water was reused for successive loads, beginning with the whites and ending with the dirtiest clothing or cleaning cloths. Water was often still heated for the machine in an adjacent copper. It was an arrangement that used far less water than today's washing practices, but it did mean that the washing was done in a single extended session. And there was a lot of heavy lifting of wet linen and clothing. Wash Day Monday was a long-established tradition that continued well into the 1950s. Automatic washing machines, so called because they washed, rinsed, and spun dry the clothes in a single cycle, were available in Australia from the 1950s. This washing machine of the late 1950s was very much top of the range at the time. This was the first machine that truly offered to free women from the lengthy chore of doing the laundry, but very few households could afford to purchase it at first. Most women, including my mother, had one of the models illustrated below it. In the 1960s, there was a very popular alternative that went part-way towards speeding up the laundry process. This was the British-made twin-tub washing machine. It was relatively cheap and very popular, and you can see it down in the bottom left there in this cookbook, actually. But it also involved manually moving the clothes from the washing tub into the spin dryer and then repeating the process to rinse the clothes. It was also quite small, but the twin tub found its way into many homes. My aunt kept hers alongside her later fully automatic washing machine because she insisted that it had the most effective spin dryer. By the 1970s, fully automatic washing machines had found their way into many more homes. In Australia, many of these continued to be so-called top loaders, which could often hold more clothes, rather than the front loaders often favoured in Britain and Europe, mainly for space saving, I think. But gradually the style of machines shifted here too, as space saving and water saving models became more popular. Many laundries now are equipped with paired washers and dryers as shown here, or even combination machines. It took longer for clothes dryers to find favour in the Australian climate, but they are now fairly common. Fully automatic washing machines finally transformed the way households, or still mostly women actually, could manage the weekly laundry load. And their arrival came just in time as more and more women entered the paid workforce. But ironically, the ease of washing did nothing to reduce the amount of laundry done. In fact, if anything, it increased. In the 1950s, for example, it was common to change one bed sheet each week per bed. The practice was to move the top sheet to the bottom and put the bottom sheet in the wash. Top and bottom sheets were interchangeable. But the advent of elasticated bottom sheets, not to mention patterned sheet sets, soon put paid to that. And many people now change both sheets weekly on every bed. That almost instantly doubled the volume of laundry. So while the labour involved in doing the laundry may have decreased substantially, many women still spend several hours each week managing it. And increasingly that work is done in the evenings after full-time work or on the weekends. In the past, ironing was another time-consuming chore. It often took all of another day. And in the summer, it must have just been exhausting because the irons had to be heated on the stovetop. That meant ironing while standing next to a running stove so that irons could be exchanged when they cooled. Most households use sets of flat irons in different sizes like these ones. The irons were also extremely heavy because they worked through both heat and pressure. 19th century housewives, I think we have to conclude, had strong arm muscles. No need for weights for them. These irons, known as flat irons, were still in use well after the Second World War. Though electric irons were made from the early 20th century, few households were equipped with the power points to use them until much later. In fact, some early irons, like this one shown here, were made with long cords and were designed to plug into light sockets. Judging the heat of irons was tricky until thermostats became standard fittings in the 1920s and 30s. But many households still used flat irons at that time anyway. Steam irons became more readily available in the post-war period, along with many other appliances. The production of more synthetic and so-called easy iron fabrics also lightened the ironing load. At the same time, it was common to iron fewer items than before. Tablecloths and cloth table napkins were used less and less, while ironing sheets became a rarity. Some have simply made the decision not to iron at all. Of all the white goods, it was perhaps dishwashing machines that took longest to win over the Australian market. Many considered them to be extravagant indulgences, even late in the last century. In 2008, the Australian Bureau of Statistics found that 52% of Victorian households used a dishwasher, and this was one of the highest rates in Australia. Now, ownership has certainly increased steadily since then, but the dishwasher is still often the last of the white goods to be considered essential. So is it fair to describe the proliferation of domestic appliances in homes of the post-war period as a white goods revolution? In a sense, I think it is, because without these electric servants, as they were first called, I doubt many of us could manage the double load of paid work and housework we juggle today. And there is no doubt that the actual physical effort involved in housework is now much less. But the appliances themselves did nothing to reset traditional gender roles. Quite the reverse. From the start, they were marketed almost exclusively to women. When the Australian Women's Weekly published their 4-part series, The Working Mother's Manual, in February 1981, they listed a host of domestic appliances essential to this new double role. The list included a refrigerator, a freezer, stove, dishwasher, washing machine and dryer, a vacuum cleaner, carpet sweeper, blender, food processor, slow cooker, electric fry pan, sandwich maker, and a microwave oven. It was an impressive list, and all while she was meant to be, quote, looking good while you work. Broader cultural change happened far more gradually in response to the women's liberation movement and the continuing work of feminists in the workforce. The social revolution that followed the march of the machine was a separate process, even if it was at least partly facilitated by it. Thank you very much.
Just wonderful. Really fascinating and thorough presentation. But I have to say, I'm still getting over the cooker stove that was used for almost 80 years. My oven was
I know, isn't it extraordinary? Yes.
yeah.
I don't know anything. I don't know anything about that particular woman. But gosh, if you were Metas, you'd be using that to advertise the appliance, wouldn't you? Or maybe not.
If the company hasn't gone under.
No, I know, extraordinary.
The thing that stood out to me most, Margaret, was the refrigerators built as safer for food. Is there actually evidence of that?
Oh, yes, I'm sure that they would have been, because I mean they could actually keep food consistently at a much lower temperature than, say, an icebox could. So the efficiency of the icebox, of course, would have ebbed and flowed depending on the amount of ice that was in it. And I don't think that the insulation was as good either as the early domestic refrigerators. But it was what I hadn't realized until we were doing this work was how dangerous some of the early refrigerants were either. There were actually people who died from inhaling these noxious gases from the first refrigerators. So it was a pretty risky business owning a fridge. And I must say too, the story, whether it's true or not, that Holstrom got the electricity producers to subsidise the cost of people who purchased his machines. I don't know if that's true. It was said that he did. But I know, they're great stories, aren't they? They must have really pulled the power, though, I think, those early. Yes.
Yeah. And homes being wired correctly for them as well. I mean, I know when I bought an electric kettle quite a few years ago, plugged it in, took out the grid. So
yes, that's absolutely right. And the thing that most people don't understand, I think, is that many people didn't have things like power points. They just literally only had electricity supplied to the house for lighting. And so that iron that plugged into the light socket is rather a beauty, isn't it? Goodness knows how safe it was, but yeah, it's a great pick, that one.
That is. Now I've got a question. On the slide with the exhibition buildings in the 1950s, was the small dark machine in the right a water cooler? If so, when was the water cooler introduced, and was it linked with the development of refrigerators? Oh, an excellent question.
Gosh, that's a great question. I have to say, Karen, that I absolutely don't know. I don't know. I don't know the answer to the question about water coolers anyway. It's an interesting one. We'll see if we can find out. There's another question in there, Katie. Do you know anything about the clothes era cupboard? Well, only that I actually had one once upon a time. Probably in the 1970s, I think. And yeah, they were actually pretty efficient. They didn't necessarily predate the clothes dryers, they existed, but they were much more affordable from memory. And they were also, they didn't use anything like the amount of power. And they were sort of like well, they were like a cupboard, only they were white and they were steel. And they just gently aired clothes. So, I mean, in cooler climates, like in the United Kingdom or whatever, where you often, you take clothes out of a dryer and you might be worried they're not entirely dry, those sorts of airing cabinets were really extremely useful. I don't know if you can still buy them, probably not. But yes, I do remember actually owning one. Didn't buy it. I think I bought it secondhand or was given it or something.
A bit of a comeback. I'm sure I was watching probably the block or something, and they built one. It's a brilliant idea. I mean, particularly in winter. We've got a lovely little comment here that I think we might end today on. Thank you for watching. Thank you very much. It was an extremely interesting presentation. As I watched and listened to this, I had to rescue our robot vacuum that got stuck in a few places and ensure it didn't go through the open door into the fish pond. Even with all these goods, we are still a slave to housework. And there's a joke, why do brides wear white? Because all domestic household appliances are white. Thank you.
Well, thank you, because I haven't heard that joke before. And we also, as you may know, have done some talks on wedding dresses and why they're white. So, I mean, that's one I haven't heard before, but it's great.
Well, thank you, Margaret. We might finish there. Thank you, everyone, for listening and tuning in. And thank you again, Margaret.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everyone.